Hello, and welcome to HMR 1, Lecture 2, as we continue our discussion of slavery, looking at not just the burden that slavery places on us, the demand that slavery places upon us to try to effect change, but trying to understand how slavery was justified, and then ultimately how slavery was understood as being a human wrong. And so we're going to do a great deal of history, but also some thinking about early modern ethics and morality and politics. And we're going to be focusing primarily on the Mediterranean, Islamic, and European world, but then also on the Western Hemisphere and the great and terrible clash that occurs after Columbus discovers the New World. So what we look at in this class are forms and attitudes about slavery and how they began to change in the wake of the Western European contact or conquest and of ultimate genocide of the indigenous inhabitants of the Northern Hemisphere, which served as a kind of catalyst in the way we think about people who are different, about the other, about people, and then also about people's basic rights and about what makes someone human. So I'm going to begin by talking about some of the older ideas about why slavery was justified or how it was justified, and also some of the philosophical underpinnings of slavery in Western thought. And one of the reasons why I do this is not just because I find it interesting, and we've all been told that these ancient philosophers are important. I'm still not quite convinced of that, but these ancient philosophical ideas from ancient Greece and Rome and early Christian thought and early Islamic thought had a tremendous influence on the way people in the early modern and modern world thought about slavery. And in particular, this concept that Arda, so artistically rendered on the board here, which you may not be able to see in this recording, but we'll take a look at, we'll have posted on the Slack site, this idea of the natural slave. This idea that somehow someone could be at once human, but perhaps not quite human, and be naturally inclined towards slavery. That there was something inherent to their humanity that made them not quite eligible for full membership in the club of Homo sapiens. So that's the natural slave idea. And we'll talk briefly about who is the great proponent of that, in particular Aristotle and Plato. We'll then move forward to look at religious ideas about slavery, and then we will find ourselves at the encounter between Europeans and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, and the question about whether or not the enslavement of those peoples was just. And that culminates in what we call the Sepulveda Las Casas debates, or the Valladolid debates of 1550. So, basic ideas about slavery. The basic underlying theory of slavery is as old as warfare itself. And the idea was that if there was a war between Group A and Group B, the Hittites and the Amalekites, between the Romans and the Gauls, that if you lost, the winning side got to kill you. And in lieu of killing you, they could enslave you. And not just enslave the men who fought on the field and women who fought on the field of battle, but also enslave their womenfolk, their children, take their goats and their sheep and their cows, and everything they have was forfeit. And in fact, it was argued that slavery was a humane result of war. Instead of killing large numbers of people, you would enslave them. Now you can imagine this creates a kind of profit motive, if you will, to war, where you might go out and seek war in order to conquer other peoples in order to take them as slaves. And in fact, the Roman Empire was really built on that principle, and the later Islamic empires, in particular of North Africa, were similarly based. So these ideas about slavery, sort of as a adjunct to war, as the outcome of war, really permeated the Mediterranean world and were influential in the way early modern people thought about slavery. Now, just saying it was based on war wasn't enough for the broader justification of slavery. And we have a whole tradition of philosophical justifications of slavery dating back to ancient Greece. So, for example, we have Plato, who wrote the dialogues. Many of you who are in political science, Poli-Sci 1, and other courses here on campus will encounter Plato. Plato is often seen as the philosopher who first came up with the idea that the world is divided into slaves and free, not on the basis of power, not on the basis of politics or belief, but because nature makes it so. And so he argued, quote, "It was right for the better to rule over the inferior," and to quote him further, "Nature herself imitates that it is just for the better to have more than the worse, the more powerful than the weaker, and in many ways she shows among men as well as among animals, and indeed among whole cities and races, that justice consists in the superior ruling over and having more than the inferior." His most famous student, Aristotle, also echoed this. For him, slavery was a natural thing. Human beings just came in two types, slaves and non-slaves. To quote Aristotle's Politics, "For that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary, but expedient. For from the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule." Some people were born natural slaves. Some people were born natural slaves, not to be slaves under any circumstance. Other people were born to rule these slaves and could use these slaves as they please, treat them as property, use them for reproduction, rape them, beat them, kill them. Now, the question one should always ask is, who did Aristotle and Plato work for? They didn't work for oppressed peoples. They didn't represent oppressed peoples. They worked for the people in power. And we always have to recall that these philosophical ideas, which are often seen as being the manifestation of justice or right action, were being elaborated on behalf of not the oppressed, but on the people who are paying the bills. So Aristotle and Plato weren't going to tell these people that it was wrong to hold slaves, because if they did it, and they did it persuasively so, they'd probably find themselves out of a job. And an interesting thought project to engage in is to imagine that there may have been people in ancient Greece and other ancient societies who did speak out against slavery, who, seeing it as an unjust and unwarranted form of human wrongness, would have stood up and said, "Hey, we shouldn't be doing this to other people." But they would not have found patrons. They would not have found people to pay their bills for them. They wouldn't have found students. They wouldn't have found pupils. And so their words would have disappeared. So philosophical ideas follow the money. And the money in this case was not on the side of the slave or the enslaved human, but on the side of the slave owner. Christian theologians, and I think that it's important to point out that no major monotheistic Mediterranean religion, Islam or Judaism, neither of them were opposed to slavery. I'll repeat that. Neither Christianity nor Islam were opposed to slavery. And in fact, both of them endorsed the obedience of the slave to the master. So two great Christian theological thinkers of the medieval period, including St. Augustine in his City of God, would also began to think about slavery, and instead of saying it was an outcome of nature, argue that instead it was an outcome of sin. And he argued that the basis for slavery is sin. That the reason why someone might be enslaved is because he or she or the people that they were from had committed some terrible sin. He wrote, "The prime cause then of slavery is sin, which brings man under the dominion of his fellow. That which does not happen save by the judgment of God, with whom is no unrighteousness, and who knows how to award fit punishments to every variety of offense." So he thought, and this is something that I think we often see when we're trying to address terrible human wrongs. He just said slavery is inevitable. It's just going to happen. And so if we're going to do anything about it, we need to try to understand it as part of God's will, as a manifestation of God's goodness. And, you probably would put in, don't commit, if you don't want to be a slave, don't commit sin. Others, like Thomas Aquinas, were a little bit more, I think, I don't want to use the word humane, but I do want to say that began to imagine the possibility that slaves should, if they're going to be enslaved, and they're enslaved again because of sin, that enslavement should carry with it not necessarily rights, but at least a guarantee of some kind of good treatment. That there, at least by the time of Aquinas, a recognition that the humanity of the slave, the enslaved person, demanded some kind of just treatment. And this is also similar in Islam, where Islam makes absolutely voices no opposition to slavery, does praise those who manumit slaves, who free slaves, but is quite frank in saying that men in particular, if they own slaves, can use them for sexual purposes, that when a conquest happens, that people can be enslaved, and actually requires that the slave be either from a different religion or be converted upon enslavement. Now, one interesting phenomenon of this sort of Mediterranean ideas about slavery, they're based on warfare and this idea of it being natural or God or purposed by God, is that in general, you didn't pass slavery down from parent to child. And in some cases, especially on the southern Mediterranean shore, children of slaves could rise to tremendous positions of authority as free people. So this was up until the 16th, so before I move on, let me just reiterate one key idea. That despite all these rules and all this sort of elaborate language justifying slavery, slavery was a brutal and cruel phenomenon. It was accompanied by rape, sexual assault, forced impregnation, right? And it required a tremendous amount of violence and brutality to keep the slaves enslaved, to keep them from absconding, meaning running away, or to keep them from rebelling. And history is redolent of examples of people seeking their freedom, of rising up against those who enslaved them. So as much as someone like Plato or Aristotle might want the slave to say, oh yeah, I'm cool with being naturally a slave, very few enslaved people would agree to that condition. So, the way to think about slavery in the world before 1500 is that there were kind of a series of agreed upon rules amongst the peoples who captured slaves and used slaves. In Europe, there was the widespread practice of agricultural indenture. In other words, that peasants were in many ways enslaved by their landlords. Throughout the Mediterranean world, there were household slaves. There are a few examples of agricultural slaves. Slaves were often brought from the sub-Saharan part of Africa up through the Mediterranean, up through to the Mediterranean Sea, then dispersed throughout the Ottoman Empire and Europe. Europeans were captured in the Ottoman Empire, enslaved. There was slavery practiced throughout the Chinese Empire in South Asia. And in fact, in the Western Hemisphere, you did have some degree of slave trading. But by and large, the people who enslaved one another were vaguely aware of one another, right? Until the 16th century. Beginning of the 16th century, very end of the 15th century, when Europeans first encountered peoples of the New World. And as they began to encounter them, they began to realize that these were not people who they'd encountered before. I mean, there's one probably apocryphal story that Columbus brought with him Christianized Muslims and others who'd been traveling throughout the Indian Ocean, to be able to talk to the people that he encountered when he reached the Caribbean. And they didn't know the languages. So here were people that didn't know, that the Europeans didn't know their languages. They dressed in ways that they were unfamiliar with. They didn't practice any religion that they knew of. They didn't practice Islam or Christianity. Who are these people? Right? That's one question to ask. But the other question to ask would be, who are these people? Who are these people? And in fact, are they people? So when I'm teaching this class in person, one of the things I do at this point is say to my students, look at each other. How do you know that the person you're looking at is actually a human being? So let me conclude this 20-minute section, and then I'm going to take a break and start up again with some basic thoughts. Slavery was based on conquest, right? It was in lieu of execution. It was justified by this idea, primarily fostered by the elite of society, that society was hierarchical, with people at the top who were entitled to rule either because of their inherent, that they were inherently rulers because nature had made them so, or because God had made them so. And that below them were striations, were strata of society going down to the very bottom, which was inhabited by people who by their very nature were barbarians, were uncivilized, were inferior, and so therefore could be enslaved. And also that the slave had no rights, had no way to make a claim on the master, and could be used for all sorts of purposes, including rape, forced impregnation, manual labor, and could be killed. And moreover, undergirding this entire edifice of slavery was the state itself. Law upon law, law courts, religious officials, doctrine, all existed to buttress the existence of slavery. So when Europeans encountered the New World, they encountered a new people. And most of them probably thought that these were people like them, but they were different enough, at least superficially so, that they could imagine that they were not quite human. And that will be the point of departure for my next lecture.